What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. The major story since the OTA has been the rise of these heavily interactive decks that are taking over the metagame in the wake of the nerfs to the Invisible Woman package and to Mr. Fantastic, who was previously supporting more point spammy, slightly less interactive versions of mid-range decks. With those out of the way, it is time for these to shine. Fenris Wolf-based Destroy Shells tend to be the things that they are based around. We obviously get Juggernaut in his cameo appearance in basically every single good deck. The dude is everywhere right now, like 2008 T-Pain, all over the charts. You are going to see a lot of that man today. Now, this is a list that is a baseline, pretty powerful list with the major upside of having a very cheap death to go alongside your other powerful plays later in the game. The upside of this list is that it is very consistent. You are very unlikely to find yourself in situations where you do not have the tools to deal with what you're seeing, at least in your deck. Sometimes you won't draw them, but you do have the tools to deal with most things that the metagame is going to throw at you in incredibly profitable ways. It's not like this deck is unbeatable, but it is an incredibly safe and powerful and consistent choice that has consistent answers to a lot of the things that you're going to see, while also maintaining a powerful, proactive game plan that allows it to win games even when those answers aren't lining up perfectly. Cannonball Mercury can very easily be a different combination of cards. For example, Lady Deathstrike and Shadow King. It's far from required in here, but I do feel like this is the apexly cringe version of the list. I wasn't sure exactly whether to split these two decks up or not. I feel like these are basically functionally the same deck. They are doing the same thing, just with a slightly different supporting cast. The first deck leans more into synergies. It gets its ramp from Luna Snow, which powers the death, and it has like a Killmonger in it, which is largely the biggest advantage that it has. This deck leans more into base power with whatever 6-drop you really want. I have First Steps Galactus. You could play Magneto. You could play Eliath. Whatever you really feel like putting in there. You are able to play this deck very, very consistently. This is, of course, the deck with no name, the deck that I used to hit rank 1. I think it's been kind of an issue the entire time, but what's really the issue is it sort of keeps popping up every time something else that's cool shows up and eventually gets nerfed. In this case, the end of turn decks showed up, ate this deck's lunch, got nerfed, and now it's back. These consistent second place decks are definitely first place in this metagame. I really only have one thing to say about Victoria Hand, and it is, ooh, Vicky, you so fine, you blow my mind. Hey, Vicky. This is an extremely powerful list, perhaps the best example of a consistent synergy-based deck that also manages to run relevant cards to deal with threats that are happening right now. But mostly it's just an excellent point package. Misery Hood, of course. Juggernaut, of course. The Victoria Hand Frigga stuff, of course. I feel like this deck has been absolutely blowing my socks off for a couple of weeks now. Maybe I would go so far as to say maybe 6 months or so. This has just been a very good thing to be doing for a very long time, and yet it seems like the developers haven't really recognized it as something that is problematic, in large part perhaps because it is confusing, because it can potentially be hard to play. We saw the 4-8 to 4-9 buff for Misery, which to me felt kind of ridiculous because this deck was already so good and Misery Hood was already so good. But whenever they do stuff like that, it's because they are balancing for a lower level of play than what I typically talk about. And so that's why you get this kind of thing that happens where I'm very confused at what a buff is, and it turns out it's actually, this is a hard deck to play. My only conclusion that I am capable of drawing from the information that I know is that this is a much more difficult deck to play than I and many others give it credit for, and I think it is very, very powerful. Just a very consistent synergistic deck that is occupying a fairly similar space to a lot of the powerful stuff in this metagame right now. You're going to see a lot of Hood Misery, you know? But this one has the high rolls and the ability to fight for lanes and allocate points on the final turn of the game just simply better than anything that is playing big 6-drops right now. There are a couple of different builds of End of Turn, and I don't want to sit here and act like End of Turn is absolutely dead. I think this is a fine deck, but it lost a lot of what kept it at the very top, which was these massive high roll final turns, and that has led to more mid-rangey builds of the list. I'm not the most sold on them. Like, you've seen probably the Safety Blade version, which is playing Thing for Steps and not playing Prodigy and just doing like typical mid-rangey end of turn stuff. I'm not sold on that. That one to me feels like you're getting rid of a lot of the upside of being in this shell to play a fairly normal mid-range deck that does cool Juggernaut Cosmos stuff at the end of the game. And I just don't know if there's a really good case for me wanting to be that version of the Juggernaut deck compared to any of the other versions that I've talked about right now. The other thing that you run into when you play a deck like this is your curves are a lot worse when you don't have a good 2-drop. And you lost a really good 2-drop in Mr. Fantastic. He's now a 3-drop, and I don't even really like playing him, but he's in here, and he's good enough, but you don't really have good curves a lot of the time. And one of the things that happens when you compare this deck to the other decks that are in its space, like I think the best direct comparison to this is the first deck we talked about today. It's a mid-rangey interactive deck that has little weird synergy things to get points. And when you play the heads up, it becomes very clear that the deck with Killmonger just wins. And so you end up playing a like, oh, we're both doing the same thing. Ha 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 ha. Except you're not both doing the same thing. The other deck just beats you in the heads up. And it makes me feel like this deck is more like the fourth best iteration of this sort of space in this metagame. When we're in these mid-rangey metagames, it can often be good to play a bit of Clog. And there are some Merlins running around, there are some Killmongers running around, but none of that has stopped Clog from being a very powerful damper on these kind of decks. A lot of these decks care a lot about doing things that are relatively small ball into snowballing things into like a big juggernaut or whatever, right? And one way to really interface with them and prevent that from being viable is to just sort of turn the ability to have that final turn power distribution off entirely. Like a lot of the V-hand stuff, a lot of the power of that deck is I am going to have a lot of power on final turns to put where I want to put it. A deck like this will say, actually, you don't get to put it anywhere that you want to put it. And I think that's majorly the upside of Clog in this context. It's just very, very consistently powerful at stopping a lot of these decks from executing their game plans. I've tried out a couple of builds similar to this previously. None of them have really sparked joy. Like this deck, the general conceit of the Quicksilver Domino Wiccan version of Afflict has been floating around for a while, but in previous metagames, it just wasn't high power enough. Like, it's very hard to deal with a Prodigy Invisible Woman when you're playing something like this. There's just not really a lot you have access to in terms of that. You just kind of get owned. And that has led to, I think, maybe a little bit of underrating of this package. I got turned on to this deck in this context by Ike Mari. I think it's a very solid deck. I played a decent amount of it, and it felt good. And it's one of the things that you can really see in a metagame that is relatively lower power and relatively higher interaction. You look at these like Fenris Wolf decks, there's not a ton of beef in them. There's just a bunch of interactive good cards. And if people aren't playing Loot Cage, like, you can really mess them up with what this deck is trying to do. Just a baseline powerful thing. You use your Wiccan plan into making sure that you have a 4 and a 3 on turn 5, and then maybe an Ajax and a 3, or maybe a 4 and a 4 on turn 6. You just always play all of your cards, basically, when you make that happen. And you tend to be able to fight for priority pretty meaningfully, which is very relevant in the context of a metagame that is not necessarily defined by Juggernaut, but definitely the contours of it are shaped by Kane Marco. And so this is a deck that has reasonable upside. Nobody is playing Loot Cage. 0 people are playing Loot Cage except you. You have the ability to fight for priority powerfully the entire game, thanks to basically always curving out. And you have these Wiccan high rolls that allow you to effectively just play every single card that you draw. That's just a very reasonable space to be in. And in a world where there's no incredibly dominant synergy decks pooping in your Cheerios, so to speak, this is a deck that very much can exist. A couple of Cerebro decks coming your way. Now, I think that I just said nobody's playing Loot Cage. These are literally the only decks that are, but I think that's not as big of a problem for an Afflict deck as you might think, because you're playing a mid-range deck, you kind of lose to Cerebro anyway, and that's really the upside of being a Cerebro gamer right now, is I think a lot of people have been like, where are the combo decks in this metagame? And the answer is Cerebro is that. Like, this is occupying a lot of the space that a Mr. Negative used to occupy, right? Like, the idea here is just, if I do my thing, I'm going to go over the top of your dinky little interactive deck, and it's actually just a quite good thing to be doing into, like, various Cannonball Mercury piles. Like, I am a firm believer that both versions of Cerebro, Cerebro 2 and Cerebro 3, are pretty consistently underrated. And I think a lot of people are like, what do you do to counter the sort of interactive pile decks? You just play the stuff that they don't have any interaction for. And Cerebro is basically that. Like, oh yeah, nice cannonball. It did so much in that lane. You're doing amazing. Oh, you don't have a Shang-Chi target? Nice. You don't have a Shang-Chi target. Sorry, dude. Goodbye. Oh, look at all of my stats. Wow, that's crazy. Imagine being able to juggernaut me when I played Cosmo, right? Like, there's just so much that this deck does. I'm not going to sit here and be like, Cerebro is the counter to the meta, but it is quite good against a lot of this stuff. It's just, you know, sometimes you don't draw Cerebro and that's bad. Someone brought up this piece of tech, the use Lockjaw to put M'Baku back in your deck in the context of Cerebro 2. I love that so much. I think this is a very cool thing to be doing. I'm not going to sit here and tell you, go get Lockjaw and M'Baku to do it. That seems a little bit ridiculous to me. But largely, I think Cerebro 2 is maybe the easier of the decks to climb to Infinite with, in large part because it is simply just going to have more points most of the time. What makes Cerebro 3 powerful is the ability to deploy a lot of the powerful cards that I think people complain about normally. Like, you look at the first deck we talked about today, you look at that group of powerful mid-range cards, Juggernaut, Negasonic, Killmonger. Cerebro 3 just gets to play those cards, and that's pretty good. Cerebro 2, though, doesn't require any of thought as to the application of what you're doing. You're doing numbers. You're playing a bunch of numbers. I know people have been talking about Blue Marvel. I'm still not a Blue Marvel believer. I would much rather play Iron Man, Hobgoblin, pretty much anything if you want to play a 5 that isn't Blue Marvel. I know Enchantress doesn't exist, but man, if it does, you're losing 8. The ongoing archetype has also fallen victim to the Juggernaut menace. I mean, this is really a sort of pick your poison here, right? The two builds of ongoing that we have are either Mercury Cannonball or Juggernaut. I'm talking about the Juggernaut one, but they're basically the same deck. This one was cooked up by Derek. The idea here is to go back to the old days of doubling Iron Men or quadrupling Iron Men or just making a lot of Iron Men and just outstatting everything reasonable. Again, no Enchantress, right? So you just end up being a very powerful deck that has very few things that can reasonably deal with what you are doing. That's a good spot for any deck to be in. Just again, when we talk about what it is to counter a metagame, like I saw a bunch of comments like, KM, why won't you make a video about how to beat the best deck in the game? It was the one I was talking about at the beginning of this video. A lot of it is just find a deck that does a synergy that deck isn't attacking. And that's why you see this ongoing stuff. That's why you see like, oh, okay, so what I want to do is dodge Shang-Chi, dodge Killmonger as best I can, and that's what I'm going to try to do. And like, that's kind of how you approach building against a deck like that. We talked about that with Cerebro, and I think it also applies here. Have a bunch of numbers, make it hard for them to interact with the numbers, win the game. That's really the ethos here. It's the same ethos that drove Fox to do the Cannonball Mercury stuff against Invisible Woman. And I will note, it is notable that we are moving away from that, because I think a lot of people think about that as a, oh, it's busted. In a vacuum, we have to play Cannonball Mercury. But to me, a lot of the reason why Cannonball Mercury was in that deck in the first place was out of deference to Invisible Woman. You would cannonball them because you would have priority, mess up their Prodigy turn, and then you'd have enough stats to beat them. And now that that context has changed, I think it makes a ton of sense for the deck list to change away from that as well. It's not just a case of, ooh, Seaball Merc, that's broken, we have to run it. I do like the Moonstone Mercury interaction. That's cool. But I do think that it's much more about, like, that was much more in deference to the dominant deck at the time, which is no longer the deck you should be teching against. This card remains a very, very reasonable ceiling deck, where what you're trying to do is just do stats at a powerful rate that is hard to interact with. And I think it manages to do that pretty well. You do have a couple of issues, though, and I've seen some recent builds that I think are pretty interesting. You can see the title of this one, what the changes are that I've seen happen across the ladder recently. I've seen a couple of different twists on this archetype, but fundamentally, it is still doing much the same thing as it always has been. You have your little Dakin combos, you're doing cool stuff, you're making big numbers. The problem is that your numbers are weirdly easy to interact with. And what I like about the deck a lot is that you can take lines that are sort of juggernaut immune, because a lot of your numbers come from scalers. But that also means you have to be really careful about, say, exposing your Morbius to a Shang-Chi too early, right? Like, that's the kind of stuff that can really, like, blow back on you in a meaningful way. And so I think this deck is actually pretty difficult to play. I've had a pretty shockingly good run with Scream recently. My basic line on Scream is that typically Scream tends to excel in sort of lower power metagames where there aren't many incredibly strong synergy decks to mess you up. And what this list has done is include Wave as, I guess I would describe it as pseudo tech against those synergy decks. Because when I talk about those synergy decks, I'm almost always talking about like a couple specific decks here. I'm talking about very, very specifically Invisible Woman decks. I'm talking about Victoria Hand decks. These decks that are looking to do massive point output on the final turn of the game by messing around with what it is that you're trying to do, and just generally are going to have more points available to them than a Scream deck is going to be able to match. Scream is best at beating other decks that are like Scream decks. They're playing a card a turn. That's what Scream is really good at beating. And so what this wave does is it takes those decks and it says, you don't get anything out of this wave. Your whole deck, by the very nature of it, is all cards that cost 4 or less. And so I am going to asymmetrically wave you. That is a 3/5 that lets me play a Magneto alongside some other stuff. That's what I'm doing here. And I think that's a very, very strong way to build the deck. I really like it. It's the only thing I've found that has made me feel good about Scream right now. This is just a really cool innovation, courtesy of Derek. There are a bunch of Pixie lists running around right now. I think all of them are interesting and cool, but this is the one that strikes me as the most meta game relevant right now. And again, I do think that a lot of it is I'm very high on Killmonger right now. Killing your opponent's demons is obviously really good. Having an out to Clog. This deck has Merlin and Killmonger. Excellent outs to Clog. All of that stuff is just straight up a powerful thing to be doing. And then leaning into the Killmonger, i.e. including the Hood. And then once you have the Hood, you have this Annihilus package. All of that stuff is quite powerful to get down early. Just generally strong stuff happening here. I think this is a very solid list if you want to play a Pixie deck right now. It has definitely been the one that has impressed me the most. I like a good Goon Knight, and I think if you want to play a Redshift deck, this is one of the two that I would be interested in playing. But I do think that there is kind of a hard cap on how good these decks can actually get. These are powerful decks, but they get really beat up by Fenris Wolf. They get really beat up by Stardust even some of the time. And they get really occasionally beat up by Killmonger blowing up your Black Knight. And they also get beat up by the fact that you can just totally brick and then not even actually play the game. I think this is a very interesting way to build a deck, but not necessarily something that I would rely on to continue performing well. It'll perform well as long as nobody is really building to beat it, but once people start building to beat it, there is a very hard cap on how good this deck can be over the long period of time. The other one you can play is Danish Hela. This is a deck that does very powerful stuff when it works. It's very Mr. Negative-esque in terms of how it plays, and it requires a lot from you when you are a snapper. Now, I do like the Gambit here because it means you are not insta-dead to Fenris Wolf. In fact, most of the time they'll play a Fenris on 2, you'll Gambit it, ba-boom, boom, boom, you feel great about that. That is kind of the upside that this deck has over the Black Knight deck. That and a higher high roll. Unfortunately, it also has a larger lose to Stardust component, which does sort of naturally place a limiter on it. When I do these videos, sometimes I do them in the context of, is this deck a good investment? And I think Hela is an interesting investment, but it will kind of naturally be capped by the counters that exist to it. I would be kind of surprised if Hela was ever the best deck again. I think it's quite good, but I'd be a little surprised if it ended up being like, whoa, holy shit. Speaking of negative, if you don't get Mobius, this deck is pretty damn good. I mean, Mr. Negative does points better than almost every other shell right now. There are things that can mess you up, but a lot of the time, you're really only worried about what am I going to do about a Juggernaut. So your good draws are going to have enough points or enough cards that you play on the final turn that you don't have to worry about that. And because you go so tall, it's very unlikely that they'll be able to set up a lane where it's like, I'm winning this one. Surely Mr. Negative won't win this one. I'll just Juggernaut the other one, because any lane that anyone feels safe about probably isn't safe against an inverted Iron Man. So Mr. Negative it's the same value proposition it's basically always been, but there are some notable new wrinkles that are downsides, right? Cerebro decks don't actually have a ton of on reveals for your gore a lot of the time, and neither do the Invisible Woman decks. And while the Invisible Woman decks got a little bit chopped off at the knees in terms of how they're going to be playing right now, you actually can have bad enough draws that you lose those games, even after a Mr. Negative now. Like, your nut draw is not as potent as it used to be, thanks to some changing context in what your opponents are. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one. Remember to like and subscribe. Thanks so much.